Section 1.7 of your textbook deals with multiplication and division of real numbers. There are some simple rules that can be followed when multiplying or dividing two positive or negative numbers. First, to determine the absolute value of the answer, simply multiply or divide the absolute values of the two original numbers. Then, to determine the sign of the answer, look at the signs of the two original numbers. If these two numbers have the same sign, then the answer is positive. If these two numbers have different signs, then the answer is negative. Now, to understand why these rules work, we'll look at some patterns and examples. First, let's consider multiplying a positive number by a negative number. The key idea to keep in mind here is that multiplication is a shortcut for repeated addition. Thus, the sum 5 plus 5 plus 5 can be rewritten as the multiplication problem, the product 3 times 5. And since the answer to 5 plus 5 plus 5 is 15, then the product of 3 times 5 is 15. Now let's look at repeatedly adding a negative number like negative 5. The sum of negative 5 plus negative 5 plus negative 5, we know from our rules for addition of negative numbers, is negative 15. Therefore, the multiplication problem 3 times negative 5, which is the shortcut for the sum negative 5 plus negative 5 plus negative 5, also has an answer of negative 15. Thus, we can conclude that the product of a positive number and a negative number is negative. Now let's consider multiplying two negative numbers. Looking at this table, we already know that 2 times negative 5 has an answer of negative 10. 1 times negative 5 has an answer of negative 5. And 0 times negative 5 has an answer of 0. As we compare those answers, we see that each successive answer is 5 more than the previous. And as we continue to decrease the number at the beginning of our multiplication problem by 1, we should expect that that pattern of increasing our answer by 5 will continue. Thus, negative 1 times negative 5 should be positive 5, and negative 2 times negative 5 should be 5 more than that, or positive 10. So from this pattern, we can draw the conclusion that the product of two negative numbers is positive. Finally, let's consider dividing with negative numbers. Remember that division is simply the inverse of multiplication. So for example, the multiplication problem, negative 4 times 6 equals negative 24, can be rewritten in reverse as a division problem. Negative 24 divided by 6 equals negative 4. Similarly, negative 4 times negative 6 equals 24 has a corresponding division problem of 24 divided by negative 6 equals negative 4. And 4 times negative 6 equals negative 24 has the corresponding division problem, negative 24 divided by negative 6 equals 4. What can we conclude from these answers? Notice that in the first two cases, our division problems each involved numbers of different signs. 1 positive divided by 1 negative. And the answer was negative in both cases. In our third case, the two numbers being divided both had the same sign. They were both negative numbers, negative 24 divided by negative 6, and the answer was positive. So we can conclude that the rules for division are the same as those for multiplication. The quotient of two numbers having opposite signs is negative. The quotient of two negative numbers is positive. What happens when we multiply more than two numbers in the same problem? Let's look at these 4 examples and draw a conclusion from them. The first problem, we have negative 8 times negative 9 times negative 10. And we can simply work our way across this problem from left to right. Multiply negative 8 times negative 9. The product of two negative numbers is positive, so that product is 72. Then we'll multiply 72 times negative 10. And since we're multiplying two numbers with different signs, their product will be negative, and the answer is negative 720. In the second example, we could again work from left to right across the problem, or, since multiplication follows the commutative and associative properties, we can group the numbers in any order we want and then do the multiplications. So let's actually group these numbers in pairs. First we can multiply -2 times -3, which is a product of 6. Then we can multiply -4 times -5, which has a product of 20. Finally, we can multiply 6 times 20 to obtain the answer 120. In example 3, once again, we can pair our numbers as before. Pairing two negative numbers, -1 times -6, we obtain +6. Pairing the next two negative numbers, -1 times -7, is 7. And then we finally have one negative number at the end that doesn't have a pair. So if we work our way across from left to right, we have 42 times -1 for an answer of -42. Finally, in problem 4, if we pair our numbers up, we'll notice that each pair contains both a -10 and a +10. So the product is -100 for each of the three pairs. Working our way across, the first two -100s multiply to give a positive answer, positive 10,000. Then when we multiply by the third -100, a positive times a negative is negative. So we end up with a final answer of -1 million. From these examples, what can we conclude about how to determine whether a product is negative or positive? Well, let's look closely at the types of numbers being multiplied and the signs of our answers. Notice that in problem number 1, there were 3 negative numbers, and our answer was negative. In problem number 2, there were 4 negative numbers in our product, and our answer was positive. In problem number 3, there are 5 negative numbers, and our answer was negative. In problem number 4, even though there are 6 numbers being multiplied, only 3 of them were negative, and our answer was negative. From the table, we can see that an odd number of negative factors in the problem, 3 or 5, corresponds to a negative answer. And an even number of negative factors, such as 2 negative numbers multiplied together or 4 negative numbers multiplied together, gives us a positive answer. So the product of an even number of negative numbers is positive. The product of an odd number of negative numbers is negative. This is a helpful rule because when multiplying several numbers at once, we can ignore the negative signs, multiply their absolute values, and then just determine the sign of the answer by counting up how many negative factors were in the original problem. Now let's practice these rules and apply them to some specific examples. Please pause the video at this time, answer these 10 questions, and then restart the video to determine if your answers are correct. In problem number 1, we're multiplying a negative number times a positive number, so the product should be negative. Our answer is -42. In problem number 2, now we have a product of 2 negative numbers, -5 times -3, so our answer should be +15. In problem number 3, we once again are multiplying 2 negative numbers, but they're decimal numbers. In this case, we can again expect that our answer will be positive, and the absolute value of our number would just simply be the product of 2.4 times 1.8. So we can multiply those numbers out. Remember that our decimal point should be 2 places to the left because there are 2 numbers to the right of the decimal point in our product. So our answer is +4.32. Problem number 4, multiplying fractions, but once again we can determine the sign of the answer immediately by noticing that we're multiplying a positive times a negative. So our answer should be a negative number. To actually find the answer, we can simply multiply the fractions. Remember that we may simplify 3 and 9 and 4 and 10. Then multiply the numerators. 1 times 5 is 5. Multiply the denominators. 2 times 3 is 6. So our answer is negative 5/6. Now let's do some division examples. In problem 5, we're dividing two numbers with the same sign, both negative. So our answer is positive 4. In problem 6, we're dividing a positive by a negative. Since the numbers have different signs, our answer will be negative 4. Problem 7, again, dividing two numbers of different signs, a negative divided by a positive. So we get negative 5 as our answer. Finally, number 8, we're dividing two negative numbers. In this case, the numbers don't divide to a whole number answer. However, we can notice that the answer should be positive because we're dividing two positive numbers. And we simply need to write our answer in fraction form by simplifying the fraction 14 over 6. Since both the numerator and denominator are divisible by 2, we can write an answer of positive 7/3. In problems 9 and 10, we're going to multiply several numbers. In problem 9, notice that there are 4 negative factors, so we would expect our answer to be positive. And we can simply work our way across from left to right, or we can pair numbers up to perform our multiplication. So our answer to number 9 is 5,600. Similarly, in problem 10, we can pair numbers up to do the multiplication. Notice that there are 3 negative factors in the problem, so we expect our answer to be a negative number. And we can see as we pair them up why that is the case. Negative 2 times 3 would be negative 6, but negative 10 times negative 9 would be positive 90. And then we multiply negative 6 times 90 and expect to get a negative answer, negative 540.